Chapter 1. Most men think they get walked over because they met the wrong woman. That's the comfortable story. Because if it's just the wrong woman, you don't have to look at yourself. You don't have to admit you trained the dynamic from day one. You can blame her personality, her past, her attitude, her issues. But the uncomfortable truth is this. Women usually don't wake up one day and decide to disrespect a man who is solid. They respond to what's permitted. They respond to what's reinforced. They respond to what a man tolerates in the beginning and then pretends he didn't. And the beginning matters more than most men will ever admit. Because early stages aren't just about attraction, they're about establishing reality. Who leads, who follows, who bends, who asks, who apologizes first, who pays emotional tax, who gets access, who gets consequences, who gets away with what. That's why boundaries aren't rules. They're the foundation of the entire psychological environment. And if you miss them early, you don't just lose respect. You lose leverage. And when leverage is gone, all you have left is arguing and over-explaining. That's when men say, "She changed." The dynamic solidified. If you've ever watched a situation slowly drift into disrespect because you kept being patient, like the video, because this video is going to save you from repeating that mistake. Subscribe if you want more truth that actually protects your peace. And comment early if you've ever realized too late that the beginning set the tone for everything. Now, let's be clear about what boundaries are, because a lot of men misunderstand them. Boundaries are not you trying to control her. Boundaries are you controlling your participation. That's it. A boundary isn't "you can't do this." A boundary is, "if this happens, I will do this." It's not a threat. It's a standard. It's not emotional. It's not reactive. It's calm, consistent, and enforced. Most men fail because they announce boundaries like speeches instead of living them like laws. They say, "I don't like when you do that." She does it again. They say, "Please don't do that again." She does it again. Now there's no boundary. There's a request. And requests without consequence train disrespect. Women don't respect what they can violate repeatedly without losing access. That doesn't make women evil. That makes them human. Humans respond to patterns. Let me talk from first person for a moment, because this is where most men relate. There was a time where I thought being easygoing made me attractive. I thought being understanding made me safe. I thought being forgiving made me mature. But what I didn't realize is that without standards, those traits don't look like strength. They look like availability. And availability without selectivity gets used, not because someone hates you, because you're convenient. That's the brutal truth. Now I'm going to lay out 7 boundaries men must set early. Not as a list you memorize, as realities you embody. And the goal isn't to turn you into a controlling man. The goal is to keep you from becoming a resentful man. Because resentment is what happens when you tolerate things you never should have tolerated, then blame the other person for doing what you allowed. Let's start with the first one. The first boundary is respect in tone, not "no yelling ever," not "never get emotional." Women are human. Men are human. Emotions happen. But there is a difference between emotional expression and disrespect. If a woman gets comfortable speaking to you any way she wants, you're done. Not immediately, but slowly. Respect doesn't vanish in one moment. It fades through tolerance. If she insults you when she's upset and you stay, you just taught her that your dignity is negotiable. If she raises her voice at you and you get quiet, hoping it passes, you just taught her that she can escalate, and you will absorb it. If she uses sarcasm, contempt, eye-rolling, dismissive language, and you try to be the bigger person, you just taught her that disrespect is safe. This boundary is simple. You do not continue conversations in disrespect. You don't argue louder. You don't become rude back. You don't storm off like a child. You calmly end it. You say, "I'll talk to you when we're both calm." Then you stop. And the key is, you actually stop. No arguing after. No explaining. No bargaining. No staying in the room while she keeps going. Because staying communicates acceptance. Chris starts dating a woman who is passionate. She gets upset easily. At first, Chris thinks it's cute. He thinks it means she cares. The first time she snaps at him, he laughs it off. The second time, he tries to calm her down. The third time, she insults him, and he forgives her because she apologizes later. Months later, Chris feels like he's living in emotional turbulence. His nervous system is always braced. He avoids saying certain things. He chooses peace over honesty. He feels controlled, but he can't name how. What happened wasn't one big event. It was early tolerance. Chris didn't set the boundary when it mattered. Now it's a personality trait in the relationship. And the reason this is the first boundary is because disrespect in tone becomes disrespect in everything else. Time, fidelity, money, effort, it starts with how she speaks to you. Now let me talk to you directly. If you're the type of man who thinks walking away from a conversation is weak, you've been conditioned wrong. The strongest man in the room is the one who can disengage without needing to win the moment. If this is already hitting, share the video because a lot of men are being taught to tolerate disrespect and call it maturity. Comment if you've ever stayed in disrespect just to avoid conflict. That's how men lose themselves. The second boundary is your time. If a woman learns early that you will drop everything for her, she will treat your time as flexible. And when your time is flexible, your value becomes uncertain. Not because she hates you, because you're always available. Men think being available is romantic. It's not. It's unstructured. A man with purpose has a schedule. A man with a schedule is respected. A man who cancels his life to respond to her emotions teaches her that his life is less important than her feelings. This boundary is simple. You do not abandon your life to manage her. That doesn't mean you ignore her. It means your purpose stays primary. And yes, that can trigger women who are used to being the center. That's fine. You're not dating to be managed. When you say you're going to the gym, you go. When you say you're working, you work. When you say you're resting, you rest. You don't apologize for having structure, because structure is masculine. Now let's pause here because this is where people get sensitive. A lot of women will say, so men can't prioritize their partner? Of course they can. But prioritizing doesn't mean abandoning self-respect. There's a difference between making room and making yourself small. Now, the third boundary is access to you emotionally. Most men give emotional access too early. They tell everything. They share everything. They vent. They open up fully. They give girlfriend-level access before she's proven girlfriend-level character. That's not vulnerability. That's exposure. And exposure without trust is dangerous. If she knows your deepest insecurities early, she can either hold them with care or use them in conflict later. Many women won't use them maliciously. But in heated moments, people reach for weapons. And if you've handed her the weapons, that's on you. So the boundary is this. Emotional access is earned. You can be honest. You can be open. But you don't dump your entire inner world on someone who hasn't proven emotional safety. Because if she gets access to your softness before she respects your firmness, she will lose attraction. Not because women hate emotion, because she wants to feel like you're stable. A man who collapses emotionally early signals instability. Now, the fourth boundary is consistency and effort. If you're the one always initiating, planning, paying, checking in, carrying the energy, you are training her to receive. Receiving becomes her default, and then men get mad later when the relationship feels one-sided. But it was one-sided from the beginning. The boundary is simple. Mutual effort or no relationship. You don't have to punish. You don't have to complain. You simply match energy. If she doesn't initiate, you stop initiating. If she doesn't plan, you stop planning. If she doesn't reciprocate, you stop investing. And you let the dynamic reveal itself. This is how you avoid relationships built on your labor. Now I'm going to stop here because we're only in chapter 1 and we've already hit 4, but I want you to feel how this works. These boundaries are not tricks. They're filters. They reveal who you're dealing with. In the next chapter, we're going to get into the remaining boundaries, including the most important one that decides whether a woman respects you long term. And we're going to talk about how to enforce these without being harsh, without being controlling, and without turning the relationship into a battlefield. Chapter 2. This is where most men start getting uncomfortable because the next boundaries aren't about surface behavior. They're about identity, about whether you're leading your life or negotiating it. The fifth boundary is your standards for behavior when she's emotional. This is where men lose the most ground without realizing it. A lot of men believe emotions excuse behavior, that if she's upset, stressed, insecure, or triggered, then tone, words, and actions don't count. So they tolerate things they would never accept from anyone else. That's a mistake. Emotions explain behavior. They do not justify it. If a woman learns early that she can lash out, accuse, manipulate, guilt trip, or emotionally withdraw when she's uncomfortable and still keep full access to you, she will do it again. Not because she's cruel, because it works. This boundary is about emotional accountability. You do not reward emotional volatility with reassurance. You do not chase someone who is pulling away to regain control. You do not apologize for things you didn't do just to calm the situation. You pause the interaction. You let emotions settle. You resume only when respect returns. There was a time where I thought being emotionally mature meant absorbing everything calmly, taking hits, being patient, letting things slide. What I didn't realize was that I was teaching people that my emotional safety didn't matter. And once you teach someone that, they will test it. This is why some men feel like they're constantly walking on eggshells. It's not because women are impossible. It's because the man never drew a line between emotion and mistreatment. Here's another example. Daniel's dating a woman who gets cold whenever she's unhappy. She stops responding. She withdraws affection. She becomes distant. Daniel panics. He apologizes. He chases. He tries to fix it. What Daniel just taught her is this: withdrawal equals control. So the next time she's unhappy, she does it again. Months later, Daniel feels anxious all the time. He feels like love is conditional. He doesn't realize that conditionality was trained early. The boundary here is simple but hard. You don't chase emotional withdrawal. You don't reward silence with pursuit. You let distance stay distant. If she wants closeness, she has to come back respectfully. That one boundary alone determines whether a man becomes emotionally managed or emotionally respected. Now let's move to the sixth boundary, because this one decides long-term power. Your boundaries around exclusivity and commitment. A lot of men want exclusivity emotionally before it's agreed upon. They act committed before there's commitment. They expect loyalty before there's a relationship. They get jealous before there's an agreement. That puts you in a weak position because you're enforcing rules that were never established. The boundary is clarity. You don't behave like a boyfriend before you're a boyfriend. You don't offer exclusivity without discussion. You don't expect commitment without agreement. And you don't invest at a level higher than the relationship has earned. Men think doing extra will make her choose them. It rarely does. What it does is remove incentive. Let me explain that cleanly. When a woman receives boyfriend treatment without being a girlfriend, she has no urgency to define anything. She gets the benefits without responsibility. And then men feel used. But the use didn't come from her. It came from unclear boundaries. This boundary isn't about being cold. It's about being honest. If she wants commitment, it gets discussed. If she doesn't, you adjust your investment. That's leadership. Now let's talk about the seventh boundary, and this one is the most important: your willingness to walk away. This boundary isn't spoken, it's felt. If a woman senses that you will stay no matter what, you are done, not because she's evil, because humans don't respect what cannot be lost. The willingness to walk away doesn't mean you threaten to leave. It means you actually leave when standards are violated. This is where men fail the hardest. They say things like, "I'm not okay with that," and then they stay. They say, "I deserve better." and then they stay. They say, "This hurts me," and then they stay. And every time they stay, the boundary weakens, until there is no boundary at all. Marcus is strong, disciplined, and confident at work. In relationships, he's terrified of loss. So when his partner disrespects him, he talks, he explains, he forgives, he gives chances. Years later, Marcus doesn't recognize himself. He's angry, resentful, reactive, and he blames her. But the truth is, Marcus abandoned himself repeatedly, and that abandonment taught her that consequences were empty. Now, let me speak directly to you. The most powerful boundary a man has is not what he says. It's what he does when something crosses the line. Walking away once does more than 1,000 conversations. And here's the part men don't like to hear. If enforcing your boundaries makes her leave, she was never going to respect you anyway. Boundaries don't destroy good relationships. They expose bad ones. If this chapter is making you uncomfortable, like the video because discomfort is the price of growth, share it with a man who keeps wondering why his relationships turn one-sided. And comment if you've ever stayed too long hoping someone would change. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how to enforce these boundaries without becoming cold, aggressive, or controlling, and why the calmest men often have the strongest boundaries. Chapter 3. This is where most men mess it up, even after they intellectually understand boundaries. They hear everything we've talked about so far and think enforcement means confrontation. They think it means speeches, ultimatums, emotional explanations, or sudden personality shifts. And that misunderstanding is exactly how men turn good boundaries into power struggles. Real boundaries are quiet. They don't announce themselves. They don't beg to be understood. They don't need agreement. They just change behavior. That's the part that separates men who are respected from men who are constantly negotiating. Let me explain what enforcement actually looks like in real life, because this is where theory becomes practice. When a man enforces a boundary correctly, there is no emotional spike, no drama, no anger, no raised voice, no long text explaining why something hurt him. The calmer the enforcement, the stronger the boundary. And this is why women respond to it psychologically. Emotion signals instability. Calm signals certainty. Women don't test men they believe are certain. They test men they think can be moved. There was a time when I thought being firm meant being harsh. I'd tighten up. I'd become cold. I'd withdraw affection aggressively. And all that did was escalate the dynamic. Then I learned something simple. You don't punish behavior you don't like. You remove yourself from it. That's it. If the conversation becomes disrespectful, you don't argue about respect. You exit the conversation. If plans become inconsistent, you don't complain about effort. You stop prioritizing them. If communication becomes manipulative, you don't explain why it's manipulative. You disengage. And the reason this works is because it creates immediate feedback without hostility. Alex starts dating a woman who occasionally makes sarcastic comments when she's annoyed. Early on, Alex ignores it. Then it escalates. Eventually, she snaps at him during a disagreement. Instead of matching energy or lecturing her about respect, Alex calmly says, "I'm not going to continue this conversation like this." And he leaves. No slamming doors, no follow-up texts, no emotional explanation. The next day, she reaches out. The tone is different. Why? Because the boundary wasn't debated. It was enforced. Now here's the key point most men miss. Enforcement isn't about getting her to change. It's about protecting your standards. If she adjusts, great. If she doesn't, you've learned something valuable early. And either outcome saves you time. This is why men who enforce boundaries don't feel resentful later. They don't accumulate silent anger. They don't store grievances. They don't explode months later over something small. Because they don't tolerate what they can't live with. Now let's talk about why men struggle to do this emotionally. Most men are afraid enforcement will make them lose her. And that fear is exactly why enforcement is necessary. If enforcing a boundary costs you the relationship was built on you betraying yourself. That's not a loss, that's a reveal. Let me talk directly to you here. If you've ever thought, if I say something, she'll leave, you were already on borrowed time. You weren't chosen for who you are. You were tolerated for what you allowed. That realization hurts, but it also frees you. Now let's talk about how women experience this psychologically, because this is where men misunderstand female psychology. When a woman encounters a man with calm, consistent boundaries, something happens internally. She stops scanning for weakness. She stops testing limits. She relaxes. Testing is not malice. It's information gathering. Women test to see where the edges are, where the structure is, where the ground holds. A man without boundaries feels like standing on unstable ground. A man with boundaries feels grounded. That groundedness is attractive, but only if it's real. You cannot fake boundaries. If you enforce once and then collapse later, you teach her that persistence wins, and once persistence wins, testing increases. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. One calm exit repeated twice is stronger than one angry confrontation. Jason decides he's going to be more firm. The next time his girlfriend disrespects him, he explodes. He gives a speech about how he deserves respect. He threatens to leave. She apologizes. He stays. What Jason just taught her is this: emotional outbursts don't lead to consequences. So the cycle continues. Jason thinks he enforced a boundary. He didn't. He vented. Enforcement requires follow-through, and follow-through requires emotional control. Now let's talk about how to maintain warmth while enforcing boundaries, because a lot of men swing too far the other way. Boundaries don't mean becoming cold or distant by default. They mean being selective with warmth. Warmth is offered when respect is present. Warmth is withdrawn when respect is absent. That's natural. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to explain it. You simply respond to the environment appropriately. This is how emotionally intelligent men operate. They are warm when things are healthy. They are calm when things are not. They are gone when standards are repeatedly violated. No drama, no ego, no revenge. That's real strength. Now let me address something important for women who might be watching this. Boundaries don't mean a man doesn't care. They mean he cares about the relationship being healthy. Men who lack boundaries feel nice at first, but they become resentful later. Men with boundaries might feel firm at first, but they create stability long term. And stability is what allows trust to grow. Now, let's talk about the internal shift men feel when they start enforcing boundaries correctly. They stop feeling anxious. They stop overthinking. They stop monitoring their mood. They stop bracing for conflict, because they know exactly what they will do if a line is crossed. And certainty kills anxiety. That's the hidden benefit. Men who enforce boundaries don't feel powerful over women. They feel at peace with themselves. And that's the goal. If this chapter is making you rethink how you've handled past situations, like the video, because awareness is the first step to change. Share it with someone who confuses being nice with being respected. Comment if you've ever realized too late that enforcement mattered more than intention. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what happens when men don't set boundaries early, why dynamics become almost impossible to fix later, and why waiting until it gets serious is usually the worst strategy. Chapter 4. This is the chapter most men wish they never had to learn the hard way. Because once a dynamic hardens, it rarely softens. Once disrespect becomes normal, it doesn't magically disappear because feelings deepen. In fact, it usually gets worse. Men often believe they can fix things later, that once the relationship is more serious, once there's love, once there's history, once there's commitment, behavior will improve. That belief keeps men stuck far longer than they should be. But here's the truth. Relationships don't improve with time. They solidify. What you tolerate early becomes expectation later. That's why boundaries set late feel like betrayal instead of leadership. Let me explain that carefully. When a man allows certain behavior early, he's not just being patient, he's setting precedent. And precedent is powerful. It creates a psychological baseline. Anything below it feels normal. Anything above it feels like a favor. So when a man finally decides to speak up months or years later, the woman doesn't experience it as a reasonable boundary. She experiences it as a sudden rule change. And sudden rule changes create resistance. Not because she's unreasonable, because the environment changed without warning. This is why men who wait too long to set boundaries get accused of changing, being controlling, or not being the same guy anymore. From her perspective, she's right. You weren't the same guy. You were more permissive before. Let me speak from first person again, because this is usually where regret sets in. There's a moment when you realize you trained the relationship to function without respect. And now, you're trying to retrofit dignity into a structure that wasn't built for it. And that's almost impossible. You can try. You can have talks. You can express needs. You can threaten consequences. But the emotional memory of the relationship resists change. Because habits feel safer than growth. Kevin dates a woman who frequently cancels plans last minute. At first, he shrugs it off. He tells himself she's busy. He tells himself he doesn't want to be needy. He tells himself he's being understanding. Months later, Kevin feels disrespected. His time feels cheap. He finally brings it up. He says it bothers him when she cancels. She reacts defensively. She says he never cared before. She says he's making a big deal out of nothing. She says he's changed. And from her perspective, he has. Kevin didn't set the boundary early. Now the behavior feels normal to her. And changing normal feels like loss. So Kevin is faced with two bad options. He either swallows his discomfort again, or he enforces the boundary late and triggers conflict. This is why early boundaries are mercy, not control. They prevent future resentment. Now let's talk about why dynamics become harder to fix over time. Attachment grows, emotional investment increases, shared experiences pile up, the cost of walking away rises, and the longer a man stays without boundaries, the more leverage he loses. Because now leaving doesn't just cost her access, it costs him comfort, familiarity, and hope. That's why men who delay boundaries often become trapped. They feel like enforcing standards now would destroy everything. And in a sense, they're right, because the relationship was built on tolerance, not respect. Let me talk directly to you here. If you're thinking, but I love her, understand this. Love doesn't erase structure, love amplifies it. If the structure is weak, love makes the collapse more painful. Now, here's another uncomfortable truth. Many men try to fix boundary issues by communicating more. They think clarity will solve it, but communication without consequence is just noise. People don't change because they understand. They change because the environment requires it. That's not cruelty. That's psychology. Now let's address the internal resistance men feel when they realize it might be too late. Regret. Regret is heavy. It shows up as self-blame, as anger, as fantasies about what you should have done, as replaying early moments where you wish you'd spoken up. But regret isn't useful unless it informs future behavior. You can't change the past relationship, but you can prevent the next one from following the same path. And that's the purpose of this video. Not to make you bitter, not to make you aggressive, not to make you controlling, but to make you deliberate. Now let me address women watching this, because this matters too. When a man sets boundaries early, it doesn't mean he doesn't care. It means he's honest about what he can live with. It means he's not pretending. It means he's not waiting to explode later. Early boundaries create safety. Late boundaries create fear. And fear breeds resistance. This is why women often say they want a man to just be honest from the start. Boundaries are honesty in action. Now let's talk about why men keep delaying boundaries despite all of this. Fear of loss, fear of conflict, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as controlling. Those fears are powerful. But living without boundaries creates a slow erosion that is far worse than a clean break early. A man who avoids discomfort early chooses prolonged pain later. That's the trade-off. Now let me tell you something important. If you feel like you're already too deep, like the relationship is already established and boundaries were missed, the path forward is not arguing. It's clarity. You decide what you can live with. You decide what you can't, and you act accordingly. That may mean the relationship changes. It may mean it ends. But staying while abandoning yourself is not a win. If this chapter feels heavy, like the video because it's naming something most men quietly carry, share it with someone who keeps hoping time will fix disrespect. Comment if you've ever realized too late that early tolerance shaped everything. In the final chapter, we're going to talk about how men who set boundaries early experience radically different relationships, why women often feel safer with these men even when they resist initially, and how to carry these standards forward without becoming rigid or closed off. Chapter 5. When men finally set boundaries early, something surprising happens. Dating stops feeling adversarial, relationships stop feeling like negotiations, and respect stops feeling fragile. Not because women suddenly change, because the environment does. Men who lead with boundaries don't spend relationships trying to correct course. They don't feel the constant low-level anxiety of wondering how far things will slide. They don't rehearse conversations in their head or brace for emotional fallout. They already know what they will do if a line is crossed, and that certainty changes everything. Let me speak from first person again, because this is the part men rarely articulate clearly. The biggest shift I noticed after setting boundaries early wasn't how women treated me. It was how I felt inside myself. I stopped feeling tense. I stopped scanning for disrespect. I stopped hoping behavior would improve. I trusted myself to respond appropriately. And that trust created calm. Calm is magnetic in a way most men don't realize. Not flashy, not loud, but grounding. Women feel it immediately. They may test it, they may push against it, but deep down, they register it as safety. Because chaos doesn't feel safe. Uncertainty doesn't feel safe. Emotional volatility doesn't feel safe. Structure does. There are two men, same age, similar looks, similar background. One enters dating hoping to be liked. He's agreeable, flexible, understanding. He avoids conflict early. He waits to assert himself until something really bothers him. By then, the dynamic is already set. He feels resentful. She feels blindsided. Respect erodes. The other enters dating already aligned with himself. He's warm but firm, open but selective, calm but immovable when a line is crossed. He doesn't announce his standards. He lives them. When something doesn't align, he disengages without hostility. Women react differently to him. Some walk away early. That's fine. Others adjust. Those are the ones who stay. And the relationship that forms feels different. Less dramatic, less confusing, less exhausting. Because boundaries did the filtering early. This is the part men often miss. Boundaries don't reduce your options. They reduce bad options. Men who don't set boundaries early end up with more experiences, but fewer healthy ones. Men who do set boundaries early have fewer situations, but higher quality connections. Now let me talk directly to you. If you're watching this and thinking, this would have saved me years, you're not wrong. Most men learn boundaries through pain, through staying too long, through tolerating too much, through losing themselves quietly. But learning it now still matters. Because boundaries aren't just for dating. They shape every relationship in your life. They determine how people speak to you, how they treat your time, how they value your presence, and most importantly, how you value yourself. Here's the final truth of this entire video. Men don't get walked over because women are ruthless. Men get walked over because they confuse patience with strength. Real strength is clarity. Real strength is consistency. Real strength is the willingness to walk away calmly. When a man sets boundaries early, he doesn't become controlling. He becomes trustworthy, predictable, safe. Not because he's permissive, but because he's stable. Women may resist that stability at first, especially if they're used to chaos, but over time, stability feels better than intensity. And the women who can meet you there are the only ones worth building with anyway. If this video helped you see where things went wrong in the past, or how to move differently in the future, like the video because clarity compounds over time. Share it with a man who keeps wondering why his relationships always turn one-sided. Subscribe if you want more conversations that cut through confusion and protect your peace. I'll leave you with this. Boundaries aren't about controlling anyone else. They're about refusing to abandon yourself. And the moment you stop abandoning yourself, the entire dynamic changes.